Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now, oh God, it's a little late, 9:12 p.m. In Central Europe. We're in Budapest. It's supposed to be spring weather, yet there's very little sunlight and sunshine to boast of. So these are the days that one should be savoring, in my view anyway, the savoring days as we head towards June the 21st, summer solstice, and then everything is downhill from then on. So to me, these are the days one should be savoring, yet at the moment there's very little to savor. Anyway, enough of this gloom and doom. Thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it. And I should say it is 3:12 p.m. on the east coast of the United States. And there's a couple of things that I want to talk about. Obviously, the big news really in the past 24 hours has been the ruling of the International Trade Court against Trump's imposition of tariffs. And the court declared, no, absolutely, Trump does not have the authority, the president has no authority to impose these tariffs under this emergency act that was enacted by Congress in the 1970s. No, absolutely no. So right away, what struck me, just on a cursory reading, is that the United States has imposed any number of sanctions against all and sundry for years and years, invoking a national emergency. In each case, the national emergency was really no emergency at all, but it was said to be apropos of something or other, that you can say anything is a national emergency. The United States was imposing sanctions during the 1990s on Yugoslavia and declaring those sanctions to be a national emergency. They were based on a national, apparently the threat that Serbia posed to the United States constituted a national emergency. So the executive branch of the government is entitled to impose sanctions and entitled to invoke national emergencies when there's no national emergency and no threat whatsoever to the United States, no interest whatsoever that the United States needs to realize. It's just the kind of fatuousness of U.S. Interventionism, interference in other countries' internal affairs, and hitting countries with very painful sanctions. But when the United States invokes a national emergency that actually involves direct U.S. interest, you can disagree, you can, with what the Trump administration says, but they are nonetheless talking about direct factors affecting the state of life in the United States. In the case of these tariffs that Trump has imposed, the most important issue that the Trump administration invoked was the soaring, ever-growing trade deficit. The trade deficit that is obviously a matter of some manipulation by other countries. Other countries pursue export-driven economies. They suppress consumption at home. They impose tariffs of their own. They impose non-tariff barriers to U.S. products, and manipulate currency. And what do you know? The United States has a trade deficit, and so this is obviously a considerable problem for the United States, because essentially it means the deindustrialization of the United States. It means just manufacturing industry leaves U.S. shores, and not only is it key manufacturing sectors that just vanish from the U.S. Shores, but the supply chains, the key supply chains, also vanish. And so when there's a genuine national emergency, suddenly, hey, America doesn't have the supply chains to be able to provide for itself in the event of a national emergency. And so, we found that obviously in the case of in the during the COVID crisis, when hey, we can't get the vital pharmaceuticals because the supply chains have moved offshore. So that is an emergency, but it's an emergency that involves direct U.S. interests. Unlike when the U.S. imposes sanctions on Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia poses no threat whatever to the United States, and instead the declaration of this national emergency is invariably greeted with glees and joyful celebration on the part of the media. No one goes to the courts and say, "Hey, you can't go around imposing sanctions on Yugoslavia and invoking a national emergency." What kind of a national emergency does Yugoslavia pose? Oh, here's a good friend, Marty. Thank you very much, Marty. Says, Fröhliche Thursday, guten Abend, George and Gagglers. And I have to look at this picture. There's a picture here of Friedrich Merz, then, the Schmerz. Yes, that's as gruesome a sight as ever. Anyway, thank you so much, as always. Where are we? Yes. Yes. Marty, I'm trying to, how do I close this picture? Okay. I've closed it. Okay. Thank you so much, Marty. Before I forget, thank you, Marty, for posting some really interesting material on Shostakovich. You particularly posted an interesting article about Pierre Boulez, one of these kind of rather, a brilliant man, no question, a brilliant man. I can't get anything much out of his composition. They don't provide me with any kind of pleasure, any real musical appreciation, pleasure, and his arrogance and disdain for concert goers, I think I found rather hard to take. That somehow concert goers, they tend to be a fairly conservative bunch, or but understandably. But that's it. I mean, it's good that they like classical music. Yeah, okay, they have conservative taste. They like their Mozart and their Beethoven and their Bach and Chopin and Liszt, and they don't really much like contemporary music, and particularly his type of a contemporary music. But that just enraged him, and he would constantly be denouncing the Philistinism of contemporary concert goers. And you got someone like Daniel Barenboim, who I think was friends with Boulez, but Barenboim was in some sympathy for Boulez on the issue of that concert goers tend to be a little bit unadventurous in their tastes, but he didn't quite have the passionate hatred for them that Boulez had. But anyway, thank you for posting that article on Boulez, which does show he was quite an even that article shows he was an insufferable person. But anyway, thank you so much. um, for posting that. And but anyway, to before I get too distracted, so I'll just talk about this um, the sanctions. So if we look at this, let me see if I can bring it up. Just the what this court ruled, um, and let me just I'll read this here. He This is the this court ruling. Um, he says, because of the Constitution's express allocation of the tariff power to Congress, which is true, it's in the first article of the Constitution. We do not read this economic emergency act to delegate an unbounded tariff authority to the president. We instead read the legislation's provisions to impose meaningful limits on any such authority it confers. And then it says two are relevant here. We have the section 1702's delegation of a power to regulate importation, read in light of its legislative history and Congress's enactment of more narrow, non-emergency legislation, at the very least, does not authorize the president to impose unbounded tariffs. The worldwide and retaliatory tariffs lack any identifiable limits and thus fall outside the scope of 1702. So let's just recap what actually happened. I mean, what the court ruled was that pretty much all of the sanctions that Trump imposed, particularly the reciprocal sanctions and the 10% base, not sanctions, sorry, tariffs, the tariffs that he imposed, and the 10% base that he imposed against pretty much everyone, all that has been swept aside. Also swept aside were the tariffs that he imposed on account of the uncontrolled flow of fentanyl into the United States. So the two emergencies that the Trump administration invoked were, as I say, this growing trade deficit, which is leading to the deindustrialization of the United States, the loss of the supply chains to the United States, which means vital industries are no longer present in the United States. And because of the deindustrialization, essentially, we're getting a financialization of the economy. And that has all sorts of undesirable effects because there's impoverishment of the many and massive enrichment of the few, the people who are doing well through the financialization of the economy. So that was one national emergency. Again, it leads directly to American interest. You can disagree. I mean, I know here there are Gagglers who don't agree with tariffs, and that's there's a legitimate debate to be had on that. But it's still something that affects direct American national interest. It's not healthy for any country to be having ballooning trade deficits. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger year by year. There's not, it's never getting reversed. And then you have the issue of the fentanyl, and that also is having a deleterious effect on the health of Americans. Clearly, that's in legitimate governmental interest to prevent the flow of fentanyl into the United States. So those were two emergencies that the administration invoked, and these were the two emergencies that the court said nope, not interested. And so if we go back to what we were looking at, we have this. So that was the court ruling, and here we have if we go back and says The worldwide and retaliatory tariffs lack any identifiable limits and thus fall outside the scope of 1702. Second, this Emergency Act limited any identifiable limits and thus fall outside the scope of 1702. Second, IAEPA, this is the Emergency Act, limited authorities may be exercised only to deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat with respect to which a national emergency has been declared and may not be exercised for any other purpose. So again, this is so bizarre that all these years the United States has been imposing sanctions, freezing assets of other countries who pose no threat whatever to the United States, pose no emergency whatever to the United States, and no one said boo. The court never stepped in and said, "Hey, you can't do that." And now suddenly, this is a matter of some alarms. And so, but if we look at what the legislation says, this is this Economic Emergency Act, and it says here, any authority granted to the president by Section 1702 of this title may be exercised to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat. Well, that's a ubiquitous phrase for the court to start. How do they put it? Let's see. Just put it the way they put it. The unusual and extraordinary threat with respect to which a national emergency has been declared and may not be exercised for any other purpose. This is just quibbling, because the United States regularly says, "Oh, this is an unusual and extraordinary threat," and that's it. Nobody says, "Oh, well, hey, that's not an unusual." Just said it. It's just a exuberant form of words, but anything can be declared to be an unusual and extraordinary threat. A trade deficit, is it an unusual, extraordinary threat? Yeah, maybe. Fentanyl coming into the country, is it an unusual and extraordinary threat? Maybe. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but since the United States has, on a regular basis, invoked an unusual and extraordinary threat, for the court to come in and say, "Whoa, you can't. That's not an unusual, extraordinary threat." Well, of course it is. It says the unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States, if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such a threat. And then goes on, the authority is granted to the president by Section 1702 may only be exercised to deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat with respect to which a national emergency has been declared for purposes of this chapter. Yes, but you can pretty much declare anything to be an unusual and extraordinary threat. Iraq poses an unusual and extraordinary threat. Iran poses an unusual and extraordinary threat. And presidents have done that. They've declared Iraq and Iran and Yugoslavia to be posing an unusual and extraordinary threat. And then it says here, the presidential authorities, at the times and to the extent specified in Section 1701 of the title, the president may, under such regulations as he may prescribe by means of blah, blah, investigate, regulate, or prohibit any transaction in foreign exchange. Yep. Transfers of credit or payments between, by, through to any banking institution. Okay. The importing or exporting of currency or securities. Okay. That's quite a lot of stuff the president can do. Investigate, block during the pendency of an investigation, regulate, direct, and compel, nullify, void, prevent, or prohibit any acquisition, holding, withholding, use, transfer, withdrawal, transportation, importation, or exportation of, or dealing in, or exercising any right, power, or privilege with respect to, or transactions involving any property in which any foreign country national, blah, blah. So you can say it mentions that importation, exportation, when the United States is engaged in armed hostilities or has been attacked by a foreign country, so on. So there's more than enough, given the powers that the president has, more than enough that he can justify invoking this unusual threat that by which he imposes tariffs. I mean, if you can freeze assets basically that's outright theft. You freeze a country's assets. If you can impose sanctions of the most severe kind under this um, emergency, you could damn well impose tariffs. Um, but that's the way it's going. Anyway, but even here's an article from CNBC which suggests that even if the higher courts, I mean, the Trump administration has already appealed this ruling, but CNBC is suggesting that Trump has other options. He doesn't have to necessarily commit himself to this economic emergency legislation. And it says here the U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that the president has overstepped his authority by invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And then the Manhattan-based court ordered a permanent halt to most of Trump's tariffs and further barred their future modification. And the White House, a panel of 3 judges gave the White House 10 days to complete and the formal process of stopping the tariffs. The Trump administration swiftly appealed the ruling. And then it says Goldman Sachs economists said the White House has a few tools at its disposal that could ensure the court ruling is only a temporary problem. So the Goldman Sachs economists say this ruling represents a setback for the administration's tariff plans and increases uncertainty, but might not change the final outcome for most major U.S. trading partners. And then it says, the Wall Street Bank said the ruling blocks the 10% baseline tariffs imposed by Trump, but the Trump administration nevertheless has other legal means of imposing tariffs, flagging Section 122 of the U.S. trade law, Section 301 investigations, and Section 338 of the Trade Act of 1930. And so it says here, Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act does not require a formal investigation and could therefore be one of the swiftest ways to get around the court roadblock. The administration could quickly replace the 10% across-the-board tariff with a similar tariff up to 15% under Section 122, as the Goldman analyst said. They noted, however, that such a move would only last for up to 150 days, after which the law requires congressional action. And then there's also the Section 301 investigations, basically of the key U.S. trading partners laying the bureaucratic groundwork for tariffs. Although Goldman said the process will likely take several weeks at a minimum. And then we have Section 232 tariffs, which are already in place for steel, aluminum, and auto imports, but they could also be broadened to other sectors. And then here, Section 338, meanwhile, allows the president to impose levies of up to 50% on imports from countries that discriminate against the U.S. And then here we have a Section 301 investigation refers to a provision of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974 that gives the U.S. Trade Representative authority to investigate and respond to unfair trade practices by other countries. And so the key purpose is to address unjustifiable, unreasonable, or discriminatory foreign trade practices that burden or restrict U.S. commerce. And then examples are intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, discriminatory tariffs, market access restrictions. So that's Section 301. And then process, the U.S. Trade Representatives, he initiates the Section 301 investigation, either on its own or in response to a petition from an industry group. And then there's the investigation, and then an attempt to negotiate to resolve the issue, and then finally the retaliation. If negotiations fail, the U.S. can impose retaliatory measures, most commonly tariffs, against the offending country. And then most recent example of this was 2017 to 18 with China, the Trump administration used Section 301 to investigate China's trade practices, concluding they were unfair. This led to sweeping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars in Chinese imports. And then we have the Section 232 tariffs, that's based on the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. And then you have the process involves, so it's, basically it's, if there is a threat to U.S. national security, the Department of Commerce conducts an investigation into whether specific imports harm national security. If the findings are affirmative, the president can impose tariffs, quotas, or other measures. And then recent use, Trump administration 2018 invoked Section 232 to impose tariffs of 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. And then there's the Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Purpose authorizes the president to impose retaliatory tariffs of up to 50% on imports from countries that discriminate against U.S. products. Key point, unlike Section 301, which often targets unfair trade practices, Section 338 is narrower and specifically deals with discriminatory treatment of U.S. goods by foreign governments. But the point that I kind of I want to make here is that it really isn't up to the courts to declare whether this is a legitimate national emergency or not. We can hear the gaggle, we can argue about this, but clearly the national emergency has been invoked by presidents many times in the past for much less threats to the United States than this. Trade deficit, may well be a national emergency. Trade deficits, budget deficits, all of that, they're intimately linked, and that is leading to a ballooning national debt, which is clearly unsustainable. These are all things that you can say, they're national emergencies. But even whether you agree with it or you disagree with it, it's still up to a president. That's what the president is there for, to decide whether it's a national emergency. If Congress doesn't like it, if Congress thinks, because after all, ultimately these powers that the president exercises on tariffs come from Congress. Congress has allowed the president to exercise these powers. And when these sections that I read out, they're all parts of legislation that Congress passed in order to enable a president to make a call as to whether some tariffs or quotas or whatever can be imposed against other countries. So yes, it's true that according to the U.S. Constitution, tariffs fall within the jurisdiction of Congress. But historically, Congress has adopted legislation that enabled the president to act on his own to impose tariffs or sanctions or asset seizures, quotas, whatever. The powers that the president has there, it comes through legislation that Congress has adopted, and Congress, specifically instructed the president to exercise powers under that legislation. So if Congress thinks that the president is acting illegitimately, that is not what the legislation was supposed to enable him to do, then the Congress can step in and stop it. It really isn't up to judges, unelected judges, to make that call. It's completely ridiculous again, because again, Congress is an elected body. Everybody in Congress has been elected to his position. the House, with district, or a state Senate seat, they will be elected, and then a president has been elected. So it's therefore this dispute will be a dispute pitting, one set of elected leaders against another. You can't have judges who have been there for life making that decision. It's not up to them to make a decision as to whether constitutes a national emergency or doesn't constitute a national emergency. That's it. That falls, within the jurisdiction of the president, and then it can fall within the jurisdiction of Congress to say, no, this is not what the legislation is supposed to be about. So I tend to think that the Supreme Court will side. I mean, I imagine is going to go up to the appellate court. It may rule against Trump, but I do think in this case the Supreme Court will side with Trump, because it's clear that it falls within his jurisdiction. That's kind of what he's supposed to do. The legislation. We went through all those different there are different pieces of legislation, not just this Emergency Economic Powers Act, but all the Trade Act and everything else. Clearly, these were laws passed by Congress to enable a president to act and impose tariffs when the circumstances warranted. But no one said the courts can make that decision. So that's the one thing. The other thing that I kind of wanted to talk a bit about, and it's kind of interesting. Well, before I get onto that, I should say that even as we speak, the conservative CPAC conference is taking place in Budapest. This has now become an annual event, whereby the American Conservative Union, led by this Matt Schlapp, they hold these CPAC events in Budapest. They ever since the American conservatives kind of fell in love on ever since these conservatives fell in love with Viktor Orban, they've been holding these meetings here in Budapest. This meeting this year is quite a big one, because obviously there's the triumph of Trump. Viktor Orban took a gamble by endorsing Trump and identifying himself with Trump. So so there's the celebration of Trump that is clearly a part of this year's conference, and Trump recorded a video message to the delegates, and of course Orban spoke, but it was quite a distinguished gathering, because Robert Fico showed up and he spoke, and then of course Alice Weidel also showed up, and so it's quite a distinguished body. Now the question is, where which is, where does this kind of nationalist, populist, national sovereignty, whatever movement go from here? And I have to say, I'm not at all sure, because Orban, who is of course the great, I see here, breaking news. I'm just looking at the headline: Appeals Court reinstates Trump tariffs. So let me just look at that. Okay, let me see this story. Yeah, appeals court reinstates Trump tariffs. Yeah, this is just simply a video. I can't really play it now. Can I? No. Anyway, so if somebody has access to the story, because then it sounds like even the appeals court, just going by the headline, I can't see if there's any text there, so I can't read the text. But it sounds from the story that the appeals court agrees with my analysis, which was that was a ridiculous ruling by the International Trade Court. Was, even on the face value, I mean, even on its face, it was absurd. I mean, it was just absolutely absurd. Like International Trade Court to start second guessing a president as to what constitutes a national emergency. But if somebody has access to the news, please feel free to let us know what exactly this appeals court ruled. But what I found, Germany is always the key. In whatever happens in Europe, Germany is always the key. And Orban has now been around for 15 years. And he was elected 2010. He was, of course, elected early in 1998. He served for 4 years. Then he lost the election in 2002 and then lost again in 2006. So he returned in 2010. And then since then, since 2010, he's really hit his stride as becoming this conservative nationalist populist, which he hadn't been during his first incarnation. But he has a tough re-election fight ahead of him. I've said this before, that Hungarians are getting tired of him, and the economy isn't doing particularly well. Thanks to the EU is making sure that the economy is not doing well with Hungary. I mean, they're putting the screws on precisely in order to make sure that the Hungarian economy continues to do poorly, in order to ensure his defeat next year. And they're going out of their way not to be provocative. And that means don't get in on all these LGBTQ issues, because if you interfere on that, if you try to attack Orban on behalf of LGBTQ rights, Orban will use that as a campaign for his re-election. He's already doing that incident on Ukraine. He's attacking his chief opponent, Peter Magyar, of being essentially a Ukrainian agent. He's working for the Ukrainian government, and so he's already using that as a campaign issue. So the EU really is desperate to get him to lose, but they're already trying not to do anything that Orban can exploit for his re-election. I know I've said this before, but I'll just say as a reminder, the classic case of this was how they ousted Milosevic in the first of the color revolutions in 2000. So up until then, all these various pro-EU figures, these kind of center-left politicians, they always lost to Milosevic. I mean, they had no real following in Yugoslavia. All the various people like Zoran Djindjic and Vuk Draskovic, they couldn't beat Milosevic. And then the EU and the United States came up with quite an ingenious idea. Hey, why don't we support a candidate who will be a Serbian nationalist? He'll be a Serb nationalist, or he'll pretend to be a Serb nationalist, and he will attack Milosevic, so to speak, from the right, from the nationalist right. and attack Milosevic of having betrayed Serbian national interests. And that worked. I think the election was stolen. I think it was a coup. But the guy that they picked, Vojislav Kostunica, did exactly what they instructed him to do. You pose and say, "Oh, Milosevic is really sold out." The Serbs, and of course, once Milosevic was gone, Kostunica turned out to be a NATO EU puppet, as I predicted he would be. I said it at the time. I got into a lot of trouble. I got fired from antiwar.com, which bought into the whole nonsense that Kostunica was the real deal. He was a real conservative, a conservative nationalist, or whatever. No, I said, no, he's not. He's going to, I mean, if NATO and the EU and the United States are throwing enormous sums of money on behalf of Kostunica, that means they know something. They know that this is the guy who's going to deliver for them. They wouldn't be doing it otherwise. Oh, no, he's the real deal. He's the real deal. Yeah, that's right. The United States is giving people, here's $100 million. Why not? Just give him $100 million. On the off chance that you might turn out to be a pro, a nationalist who's going to be, even harder in support of Serbian national interest than Milosevic was. And of course, he didn't. He immediately betrayed the Serbs, and that was that entirely as one predicted. He appointed Djindjic, the hapless Djindjic who could never win an election. He made Djindjic the prime minister, and it was a scam. The Serbs were stupid enough to fall for the scam, but hey, I can't protect people from their own stupidity. But anyway, going back to that, they're trying to pull something like this with Peter Magyar, that somehow Magyar is the real deal. He's the one who's really championing Hungarian national interest. He's the one who's a real Hungarian nationalist, not like Orban, but no, Magyar is the real Hungarian nationalist. And that's why they had this thing in Romania, where, if you recall, there was this George Simeon, who won the first round of that election, but the Hungarians, the ethnic Hungarians of Romania, were not happy because Simeon. They knew Simeon very well. Simeon was someone who had risen to prominence in Romania as a big opponent of the Hungarians. He was a Romanian nationalist. He didn't like the Hungarians. And the Hungarians were absolutely determined to vote against him. Orban kind of hemmed and hawed, but eventually declared, well, all right, I mean, since Simeon said, I'm going to follow Hungary's lead, my hero is Viktor Orban, I'm going to form an alliance with Hungary. And so Orban said, all right, well, fine. I can't see anything wrong with Simeon. And of course, then he came under attack from the Hungarians of Romania, saying, don't you realize what this guy is about, what Simeon is about? And then Orban kind of backed away and said, okay, well, I'm going to leave it up to the Hungarians of Romania, and they need to make a decision of their own as to who best represents their interests. But this was then used against Orban by Peter Magyar. Hey, look, Orban is betraying the interests of ethnic Hungarians. He's not a nationalist. He's doing nothing for the Hungarians. He's betraying the Hungarians. Look. He supported. He didn't, Simeon in Romania. He didn't really support him, but they're using that. So that's the way they're going to play it. Now, will it succeed? Maybe. We'll have to see. Um, but he's underwater in the polls. I mean that's happened before. He's pulled it off in the past. But definitely a possibility that he would lose. Once he's defeated, then it'll be very easy to defeat Fitzo. Hungary is much more prominent. Slovakia. Hungary is a bigger country. Orban has an international profile. Fitzo is hardly known, other than a a kind of mini Orban. But the question is then, is AFD the alternative for Deutschland? And they won 21% of the vote in the election earlier this year, which was quite an accomplishment. But it didn't translate into anything for them. Not a thing. Because all the political parties ganged up on the AFD and said, we will give them nothing. Not just any, it's not just a matter of, oh, well, they're not going to have a place in any coalition government. We'll give them nothing. We're not even going to give them a committee chairmanship. We're not even going to give them a committee vice chairmanship. So in the Bundestag, they don't have a single committee chairmanship and they don't have a single committee vice chairmanship. Political parties like the Greens, like the Social Democrats, like the Left Party, all of whom did much worse than the AFD in the recent election, they have committee chairmanships. They managed to get it, but nothing at all for the AFD. So until you can break through this lock that prevents the AFD from getting anything, then Alice Weidel, she can come along, make good speeches. She's a good speaker. She's very effective in debates. I think she expresses herself very well. She's very smart, very articulate. And you can keep doing that. I see Stone River says a federal appeals court has paused Wednesday night's ruling from the Court of International Trade that blocked President Trump's tariffs. The United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, okay, that's the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, ruling restores Trump's ability to levy tariffs using the emergency powers he declared early this year. The appeals court also ordered that both sides provide written arguments on the question of blocking Trump's tariff to be filled by early next month. Okay, well, as I say, I mean, I think that this is sensible. I mean, I thought that ruling by the International Trade Court was just idiotic. I mean, it was just just on its face was an obviously idiotic ruling. So anyway, thank you, Stone River. So that's the thing. If you can't make a breakthrough, then I don't know where it goes. I mean, because ultimately the AFD would need to get something, not 21%. They need to get something in the order of 40% of the vote, or at least somewhere 35 to 40% of the vote, to get, at the very least, the committee chairmanship. In other words, they become a party so strong that they cannot be ignored. They can probably be kept out of the government. You can always just form a national coalition to keep out the AFD, but you can't prevent them from getting committee chairmanships. But that's a tall order, to go from 21% to say 36, 37% of the vote. So that's you'd have to think that does right-wing populism, national sovereignist movement in Europe have a future? I don't know. I'd say it's the jury is still out on that. So you can have these great conservative CPAC conferences, and they're quite interesting. But whether this is really portending a major realignment, I don't know. I mean, you look at what happened in Germany. The Social Democrats, deeply unpopular. Sergeant Schultz, very, very unpopular, had an election, worst ever performance by the Social Democrats, worst ever. And they're still in the government. Nothing changed. They're in the government. Friedrich Merz, awful person, a truly vile human being. Did very poorly, one should say, in the election. Yes, he came in at number one, and he's now, I think, trailing in the polls to the AFD. But he came in number one, but a historically low support. He's the chancellor. So the political establishment in Germany is very, very strong, and it's prepared to do whatever in order to keep all newcomers, all populist insurrectionists out. It'll do anything. It'll do, whatever. It could ban the AFD. It could imprison the AFD, and it'll all be done in the name of democracy. They're ready to do all of that. So it's going to be a difficult one. I mean, we don't even have to get onto the issue of Marine Le Pen. The Mickey Mouse charges brought against her, and so, she can't run in 2027, even though she's leading in the polls. And what is extraordinary about that decision by the French Constitutional Court is that the people who was punished, it was the French people who were punished, because the French people were prevented from voting for the candidate of their choice. In other words, it's not just, oh, well, she can't run for office, but you're actually disenfranchising French voters. You can't vote for her. Why not? Well, because we don't like her. But that really is the point. You're punishing voters, and you can't do that. That's a real threat to democracy when unelected judges tell voters whom they can and can't vote for. And remember, even in the sort of the bad old days, we had Eugene Debs. He ran for president from prison. In the United Kingdom, you had Irish nationalists who were in prison and were elected to parliament. They were actually in prison and they were elected. They couldn't take their seats in parliament because they were in prison. So there's absolutely no reason whatever why somebody cannot be in prison, run for office, and still be eligible to take up his seat. He may be in prison. He may be physically unable to take up his seat. Nonetheless, you've given the voters the right to choose. If they choose to vote for somebody who's sitting in prison, then that's their right. That's what democracy is supposed to be about. I mean, they know this person's in prison, and they're going to vote for that person who's in prison. So what the French court did was to punish the voters, and that's what the German government intends to do if they decide, if the Otto Yan, I just saw somebody's name as Otto Yan. That's very interesting. I mean, I wonder whether the person who calls himself Otto Yan is naming himself after Otto Yan. I don't want to go now into a big digression as to who Otto Yan was, but he was a head of West German counterintelligence in the 1950s, who defected to the East, and then showed up in the East, gave a news conference, and so on, and then he came back to the West, to West Germany, and said, I was kidnapped, I was, they tortured me, and so on. And the German authorities didn't buy the Otto Jan's story. That's my name. Oh, it's your name. So, okay. All right. Well, so I won't then go on into Otto Yan, but because I thought that you got it from Otto. He's now a forgotten figure, but he was a kind of curious adventure during the Cold War. I mean, it's not every day that the head of German counterintelligence defects to the East and says, "Yeah, I'm with you. I support the East German government, and then he returns to the West and says, "Yeah, I was kidnapped and I was tortured. I was forced to make that statement." And then the West German government wasn't buying it for one moment, sent him to prison, but for a ridiculously short time. And then he came out of prison and then became this expert on on intelligence. You regularly see him on the BBC. Otto Yan, no, Herr Otto Yan. What is your opinion on this and that? And he was always very harsh when he was condemning other spies. He was once on a show on Kim Philby, the famous British spy, and he says, "Well, Herr Yon, what is your opinion of Kim Philby? Is that a traitor? He was a traitor." So yeah, but what about you? I mean, you kind of defected and then suddenly reappeared. Anyway, all right. It's all a kind of a distraction. S.A. Dillendam says that was a bomb plot. Otto Yan was a very strange figure. He was also involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. And somehow, as people know, almost everybody who was involved in that plot was arrested and executed. Even and people who were tangentially involved were executed or essentially forced to commit suicide, like Rommel. So Rommel wasn't executed, but he was forced to commit suicide. But Jan was involved in that, but somehow he escaped. I mean, he was a very, very devious character. So the moment I see Otto Yan, kind of, makes me think of that. Anyway, but one thing that I wanted to talk about, that what's going on in the Baltic Sea is getting quite interesting. As you know, the Estonians, basically the noisiest of the Baltic chihuahuas. It's the country that gave us Kaja Kallas, has been blustering about seizing Russian ships or ships that are transporting Russian oil. Now, that's quite a serious escalation because, of course, these are ships that are in international waters. And if you seize a ship in international waters, then that's an act of piracy and is obviously an act of war. But nonetheless, they've been pushing forward, and they adopted a law back in April, giving them the right essentially to board ships that are carrying Russian oil. Now they dressed it up as all these are threats to security, to the Russian these ships that are carrying Russian oil are destroying undersea infrastructure, blah blah. Even though they had no evidence that any of them had done any destruction. But it was a major escalation when in April Estonia adopted this law. So let me just show you something about that. And this was the report in TASS at the time. It says that Estonian president approves law enabling military to attack civilian ships. It says, according to the media, the approved amendments give the Estonian Defense Forces permission to use force in the country's maritime zone to address threats against critical infrastructure, defense facilities, ports, and other installations. But it's not the maritime zones. They're saying that they have the right to seize ships in international waters. And then here we have this Estonian president, Ala Karis, has approved amendments to the law on the organization of the defense forces and the economic zone, which stipulate that the military can attack any civilian vessels they see as a threat to the country's crucial facilities. This is the ERR broadcaster reported. According to the media outlet, the approved amendments give the Estonian Defense Forces permission to use force in the country's maritime zone to address threats against critical infrastructure. So that's how they're trying to dress it up, that this is a threat to the critical infrastructure, even though, as we know, the only threats to the critical infrastructure were the threats coming from NATO, namely like Nord Stream, which was obviously blown up by parties associated with NATO. So defense facilities, ports. And then Russian President Patrushev, who chairs the Maritime Board, slammed the Estonian law as disgusting and highlighted the need to axe the initiative. And here's Zaharova. She said on Thursday that Estonia's adoption of legal amendments allowing the country's navy to use force against foreign vessels was a provocative action that poses risks to shipping and security in the Baltic Sea. Now remember, NATO has been boasting that the Baltic is a NATO lake. I mean, they said it's a NATO lake because it's basically now with, essentially it's surrounded by NATO states. So they feel anything that happens in the Baltic is NATO's business, even though these are ships that are in international waters. And then here's this article in Modern Diplomacy saying the Russian-Estonia standoff, tensions escalate in the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic Sea has become a geopolitical flashpoint in recent months. Notice how it's a geopolitical flashpoint entirely caused by Estonia. So if Estonia has done this with a view to provoking a crisis with Russia in order to be able to scream that we're under attack from Russia. Article 5, you need to come in on our side. That's what they're doing here. They're trying to provoke a confrontation with Russia in order to be attacked by Russia, and then they can invoke Article 5. And NATO has just gone along with this. At the heart of the tensions is a series of confrontations between Russia and Estonia, a small but strategically significant NATO member state. Recent incidents, particularly those involving Russia's so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers, underscore broader issues of maritime security, blah, blah. The standoff not only highlights the fragility of the Baltic Sea's stability. I thought it was a NATO lake, so now it's fragile and the stability, but also raises questions about NATO's ability to deter Russian aggression in a region critical to European security. Russian aggression. So, as I said, this is a crisis that has been provoked by Estonia. What they call the shadow fleet of tankers are doing nothing wrong. They're in international waters. Whatever sanctions the EU has imposed on Russian oil are not binding on anybody other than members of the EU. They're not binding on Russia. Russia's not a member of the EU, and since it's obviously the target of the sanctions, it's not exactly going to be commit itself to observing sanctions against itself. It's not a shadow fleet. I mean, they're using that as saying, oh, they don't have insurance. They do have insurance. They don't have insurance from Western insurance companies, but the reason they don't have insurance from Western insurance companies is that because of sanctions, Western insurance is not available to Russian ships. That's it. It isn't available to them, so they have to get the insurance elsewhere. They get insurance from Russia. So they are insured They just don't have a Western insurance, and they don't have Western insurance because Russia has been banned from the Western insurance market. I see Otto Yan puts in the knowledge of Otto Yan. I just have to, I know I'm getting distracted, but I have to read this. He was a German lawyer and intelligence official during World War II. He was a conspirator in the 20th of July plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Yes, as I said, who remarkably managed to survive. Everyone else who was involved in that plot was executed. But Otto Yan survived and then reemerged as this head of German counterintelligence, who mysteriously defected and then equally mysteriously returned. And then equally mysteriously became an expert on intelligence. You would showing up on television panels, and I can see he lived a ripe old age, 1997. Just shows I don't know what it shows. It certainly doesn't show that good people live long lives. That's it. But anyway, this is a provocation instigated by Estonia, which certainly, as we'll see, is potentially quite dangerous. And it says that that thing about the let me continue. The Estonian naval forces attempted to intercept the Jaguar, a Gabon-flagged oil tanker suspected of being part of Russia's shadow fleet. I said it just gets on my nerves when they keep talking about this shadow fleet. It's not a shadow fleet. A network of vessels used to transport Russian oil in defiance of Western sanctions. Why should anyone care at all about Western sanctions? They have no binding force in international law. They were never sanctioned by the United Nations. So they're just simply sanctions imposed by a bunch of Western countries. Well, who cares? The tanker, which has recently been added to a UK sanctions list, was sailing in international waters. Also, they admit that it was sailing in international waters between Estonia and Finland when Estonian forces sought to verify its documents and legal status. It has no business verifying its documents and legal status. It's in international waters. It has nothing to do with Estonia. And the whole purpose of this, of what Estonia was trying to do, was to provoke a confrontation. The vessel, and typically the vessel, refused to cooperate, prompting a dramatic escalation. Russia responded by deploying a Sukhoi Su-35 fighter jet, which briefly violated Estonian airspace, according to Estonian authorities. This incursion, coupled with NATO's subsequent deployment of Polish MiG-29 jets to tail the Russian warplane, brought the two sides dangerously close to a direct confrontation. Okay. Maybe it's not such a great idea to start seizing ships in international waters. And they knew this. This was in April when Estonia passed this legislation, and we covered this on the Gaggle when they did this. I mean, so it should have been obvious to NATO that this was going to be a problem, and NATO did nothing about it. The Jaguar ultimately escaped and anchored near the Russian port of Primorsk. But the incident left a lingering sense of unease. Estonia summoned Russia's charge d'affaires in Tallinn to deliver a formal protest. A protest about what? You instigated this. A protest about what? Accusing Moscow of violating international law and NATO airspace. What law did Moscow violate? And the NATO airspace even this article says, well, that's what Estonia claimed, and probably Estonia shouldn't have um, tried to board a ship in international waters. Just days later, Russia detained a Greek-owned oil tanker, the Green Admire, after it departed from an Estonian port. The vessel was released shortly afterward, but the detention was widely seen as a retaliatory move against Estonia's efforts to enforce sanctions. Okay, Estonia has no right to enforce anything on anyone. And then Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna described Russia's actions as a response to Estonia's campaign to inspect tankers suspected of carrying Russian oil, signaling Moscow's willingness to use military force to protect its shadow fleet. Its willingness to use military force to prevent piracy. I mean, Moscow had to show that it can't just have, because if it didn't do anything, Estonia, and no doubt others, taking a lead from Estonia, would start seizing ships carrying oil. And then Russia's shadow fleet has emerged as a central issue of the Baltic Sea standoff, comprising hundreds of aging tankers with opaque ownership structures. These vessels often sail under flags of convenience, lack proper insurance. They have insurance, not Western insurance, they have insurance, and operate without Western safety certifications. Okay, have there been any accidents involving any of these ships? You say they don't have Western safety certifications. Okay, any incidents, dangerous incidents, oil spills or anything that you can report? Estonian estimates suggest that up to 85% of oil exports, which account for roughly 60% of its oil revenue, are transported via this fleet to buyers in countries like China and India. Okay, and then the Russian Estonia standoff is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of Russian hybrid warfare in the Baltic region. No, it is not. It's Estonia that has provoked this. Even this, as this article goes on, this article admits that the whole thing was started by Estonia, and then it just sort of segues. They suddenly realize, we can't really say that this is yet another case of NATO starting a confrontation. Instead, that we talk about a Russian hybrid warfare. What hybrid warfare? Russia is transporting its oil as it is legally entitled to do. It is Russia's oil, and it is delivering the oil to consumers of its oil. It's a multifaceted strategy combining military force, plausible deniability, and information warfare. And, this is usual NATO land claptrap. Russia's suspected involvement in sabotaging undersea infrastructure. Suspected involvement. You haven't come up with a single piece of evidence. We've covered this extensively on the Gaggle. All the media stories about the involvement. There's not been one scrap of evidence that's emerged that Russia was involved in sabotaging undersea infrastructure. Now, there is indeed damage that occurs to undersea infrastructure. The Baltic Sea, it's very heavy traffic in the Baltic Sea, and some things may well damage undersea infrastructure. But what's the evidence that Russia was involved in any of that? Anyway, since January, NATO's Baltic Sentry mission has been patrolling the sea to protect critical infrastructure. Just didn't really protect Nord Stream, though it lacks direct authority over the shadow fleet. You don't say. It doesn't have any authority over ships that sail under the flag of other countries. Well, that's amazing. You don't have any authority over that. And then here we have quite an interesting story. The Finnish defense minister says Russia started using warships to escort shadow fleet tankers. That's interesting. So now Russia is using warships in the Baltic. And he says Russia has begun moving its shadow fleet of oil tankers through the Gulf of Finland under the escort. Russia's armed forces, a Finnish defense minister confirmed in an interview, and so on. The Estonian defense forces later added that Russia has intensified its patrolling, but is not directly escorting the vessels yet. And it says Russia is now protecting the tankers that are part of a shadow fleet in the narrow waters of the Gulf of Finland. There has been military escort activity and the presence of armed forces. And then he says on Friday, May the 23rd, the Finnish defense forces reported that 2 Russian aircraft had violated Finnish airspace off the coast of Porvoo. According to Hakanen, the aircraft involved were Russian fighter jets. And then Moscow has now openly demonstrated military readiness to protect energy shipments, circumventing sanctions. This marks a completely new level and a very serious development, says Hakanen. According to him, while Russian military presence in the Baltic Sea is not new, it's not new because it's a Baltic power. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's not new. It's a Baltic power. It has ports in the Baltic Sea. Such systematic armed escorts for oil tankers are unprecedented. Well, yeah, they're unprecedented because NATO states took it upon themselves to start seizing ships in international waters. What was Russia supposed to do? On May the 13th, an incident occurred in the Gulf of Finland in which the Estonian Navy attempted to stop a Russian tanker violating sanctions regulations, but the vessel ignored the orders. Shortly after that, a Russian Su-35 fighter jet was spotted in the area, violating NATO airspace for a minute. This was considered by the Estonian authorities as a military response to Estonia's lawful interception of the nationless tanker checker. Estonia determined that what he was doing was lawful. I wonder what law it was observing. How did Estonia adjudicate that it was complying with international law? What court adjudged that this was a lawful interception? Whereas the so-called shadow fleet had previously operated quietly and covertly, it wasn't quiet and it wasn't covert, it was out in the open. The Kremlin has now decided to make a show of force, signaling that it is prepared to defend its illicit oil trade. Illicit. There's nothing illicit about it. It's acting in a legal, lawful manner. It's providing oil to consumers who paid for that oil. There are no internationally recognized sanctions in place sanctioning Russian oil shipments. So there's nothing illegal about it. Hakanen stated there is no direct threat to Finland, but added Russia is strengthening its military capabilities and remains a dangerous neighbor for all of Europe. Well, maybe if it's so dangerous, maybe you shouldn't go around provoking it. And then here is Nikolai Petrushev, who is the head of the he was the head of Russia's National Security Council. Now it's that Shoigu is the head of that. So he's now chairman of the Russian Maritime Board. He announced, so that was the other day, that Russia is preparing to counter Western efforts to restrict its shadow fleet operations in the Baltic. Patrushev stated that President Putin supports the Maritime Board's proposed countermeasures against what Russia perceives as Western attempts to limit maritime traffic in the region. Patrushev accused Western nations of engaging in piracy under the guise of increased NATO activity in the Baltic Sea. He cited an incident where the Estonian Navy attempted to intercept the Russian cargo ship, the Jaguar, in the Gulf of Finland. And then he further alleged that Western countries are violating international law by attempting to control ships carrying goods for Russia in international waters. They are adjusting the regulatory framework to do this, Patrushev claimed. He criticized Estonia for attempting to detain ships heading to Russian ports under the pretext of protecting critical infrastructure, noting that Estonian authorities have the legal right to open fire. Russian ports under the pretext, blah blah. He criticized, noting Estonian authorities did not have. I think it means do not have the legal right to open fire on dangerous ships. Okay, that doesn't make much sense. It sounds like a poor translation. Patrushev emphasized the need to strengthen the protection of critical maritime infrastructure in Russia's Leningrad region, citing growing threats of sabotage and terrorist acts, including those involving unmanned aerial and naval vehicles. He concluded by asserting that the Russian Baltic Fleet is effectively ensuring the safety of maritime navigation and preventing provocation by the naval forces of unfriendly countries. So, the reason I bring this up is that it's a could be a serious issue if Estonia and its enablers decide to go on pursuing this. It seems like a very dangerous move, but clearly there are powerful forces within NATO that are eager to provoke a serious confrontation with Russia. We've talked about it at length with Trump, how they're trying to push Trump into escalating U.S. involvement in Ukraine, essentially sabotaging Trump's attempts to bring the war to an end. And so this is another dimension of that. Hey, let's see if we can provoke something in the Baltic. Anyway, let's go to our locals page, and here are the members of our locals community who always have very interesting observations and are very generous in their contributions. They're the ones who ensure that the dogs are fed. The dogs don't get depressed. As we know, the dogs get very distressed when there's no movement in the tip jar, and when they get depressed, and they take their sorrows out on me. So really appreciate everyone who's thinking about the dogs. Anyway, Robert says, ciao from a still rather gloomy, cool New Jersey. Well, yeah, that was still gloomy and cool in New Jersey. A situation making it harder to reconcile the fact that the summer solstice is just weeks ago. Yeah, no question. Because for me, this is always the best time of the year. This last 2-3 weeks before we get to the summer solstice, and then boom, it's downhill all the way. It's just gloom city, miserable city. It's just the depressing darkness of fall and winter. It's inexorable. So anyway, but thank you, Robert. Ergo says Denver area is gray and gloomy and has been unusually wet. It seems to be there seems to be a pattern here. I don't want to get into speculation about whether the people may be doing untoward things, but there are people who speculate. I should let me put it that way, that something untoward is being done to the weather. And here we have Anne Marie. Thank you very much for your generosity, as always. Anne Marie was a very distinguished musical contributor, and she really posted something very beautiful on on our page on the Gaggle Music Club, which was the selection was Shostakovich's Symphony Number 7, the Leningrad Symphony, and Anne-Marie has always showed her a critical musical acumen in her observations about Shostakovich's work, all the different kinds of work, his symphonic work and his piano work, his string quartet work. But what I think is really interesting and that Anne-Marie revealed is that she performed Shostakovich's 11th Symphony under the great Valery Gergiev. That's quite an accomplishment. So, wow. I mean, kudos to Anne-Marie to be, for that. Valery Gergiev, as you know, was fired from his position in Germany. I think it was the Bavarian Orchestra, well, maybe the Munich Orchestra. I can't remember. But he was fired from that position on account of insufficient criticism of Russia, Putin, and the so-called SMO. Now, this is always such a dishonor. The same thing happened, of course, to Netrebko in New York, as the famous soprano. In the first place, these are artists. They're under no obligation to make any political pronouncement whatsoever, because they're artists. This is their whole life is devoted to art. It's the same with athletes. I mean, their entire life is devoted to be as good as they can be, to be the best in the world. I mean, that's a full-time job, to be the best in the world. And so similarly with Gergiev or Netrebko, to perform at that level, you have to devote all of your energies toward that. And so, he's under no obligation to take any kind of to take any part in politics. However, it's also particularly obnoxious because, on the one hand, if they're saying that Russia and Putin are, totalitarian and so on and so forth, then on what basis do you demand that somebody risks his or her life to speak out against somebody that you claim is a totalitarian mass murderer? You're asking that person, not only to endanger his or her life, but to endanger the life of his or her family. How can you do that? How can you do that? If what you're saying about Putin is right, then it's entirely understandable why Gergiev or Netrebko don't want to say anything. And so it was always ridiculous. And they tried that stuff also with the athletes, with mixed success. I mean, they were forced to accept athletes to perform in international competitions, but they weren't allowed to perform under their national colors. They couldn't perform as representatives of Russia. They couldn't have the Russian flag. The national anthem could not be played. Russia and Belarus, but they did allow them to compete. The swinish British, they're always the worst. The scummy British actually prevented the Russian and Belarusian tennis players from competing in Wimbledon. I think that was in 2022, either 2022 or 2023. But they were forced to retract. I mean, they got into a lot of trouble for that, and they were forced to retract that. But one of those years, either 2022 or 2023, they prevented Russian and Belarusian tennis players, who are the best in the world, from competing. Again, obviously entirely outrageous to punish them for something that they had nothing to do with. But yeah, that was the case of Gergiev. But the important thing about him is that he's an outstanding artist. He's an outstanding conductor, and even if the fact, yeah, all right, he had good relations with Putin, but why wouldn't he? I mean, Putin had done a great deal to promote art in Russia, Russian art in Russia, Russian music in Russia. If you're an artist and a musician, this is something that you're naturally going to be enthusiastic about. But anyway, please go to the Gaggle Music Club. Please listen to the Shostakovich Leningrad Symphony, and above all, please read Anne Marie's really interesting and fascinating and moving observations about the symphony, about Shostakovich, and about Gergiev. So anyway, thank you so much, Anne Marie. Thank you for your generosity. And then Vic Shakapopoulos says, "Dear George, I think you believe Nixon was ousted because of some sort of a conspiracy. How do you think it changed the course of history, and who benefited from it?" That's a very good question. I tend to think, yes, that it was a conspiracy. I think what happened as a result is that it fatally weakened the presidency, the powers of the presidency, because the struggle between Nixon and Congress was actually quite acute during his time, and Nixon and the courts. So in some ways, there was really there's a parallel with what's happening now. In a way, Trump is trying to somehow go back to that era, to that fight that Nixon had, because if you think about Nixon, first of all, he won an election in 1968, in which Congress was heavily dominated by the Democrats. That's very unusual, for American history. Somebody wins a presidential election, but the opposing party dominates both houses of Congress. You had the bureaucracy that was still very strongly influenced by FDR. There was obviously the remnants of the FDR New Deal coalition, the Truman, and obviously the Kennedy Johnson people. They were all still absolutely firmly ensconced within the bureaucracy. They didn't like Nixon. They hated Nixon. They were never going to cooperate with Nixon. So that was that. Then you had a Supreme Court that was also not at all sympathetic to Nixon. This was the Warren Court when he he became president. He was still Earl Warren, who was the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and it was still the heyday of Warren when they were just issuing all these rulings, throwing out all kinds of pieces of legislation on dubious grounds, shall we say? But so that was so. He was really from the start in a embattled position. Bureaucracy, both houses of Congress, the courts, and the Supreme Court, all of whom were unsympathetic to him. But he tried to, I think, restore the power of the presidency. Obviously, that it met with resistance. Remember, he tried to do that with the basically. He felt that he's under no obligation to spend money that Congress appropriated. I mean, this is part of the government, U.S. government. I mean, the president has a discretion as to whether to spend funds that Congress appropriate or not. But Congress obviously fought against that, and particularly after his fall, the presidency was really weakened, and the post-Watergate Democratic Congress, particularly the guys who won in November 1974. That was the post-Watergate Congress, and they adopted all sorts of legislation that weakened the presidency. And I think Trump, I think, is trying to restore some of the powers of the presidency. But what you're seeing now is, in a way, has its parallel to what happened under Nixon. Now you're getting Trump, though he has the control of both houses of Congress, which Nixon didn't have, he's being stymied at every step by the courts. The courts who basically say, no, we know better than you do what your powers are, what you're able to do, what you can't do. Apparently you can't even fire people who actually work for you. So I think the other thing is that it's somehow his downfall enshrined the particularly insipid and poisonous kind of liberalism that has seeped into every aspect of culture. Nixon, in whatever way, kind of tried to resist all that, but the exuberant triumphalism of having defeated him, defeated the hated Nixon, the sort of the tricky dick of liberal nightmares, the person that everybody had hated, and we did it, we crushed him. The humiliation that we suffered when he came back and won in 1968, the double, triple humiliation we suffered when he won by a landslide. This horrible person, this tricky dick of liberal nightmares, and we did it. We crushed him. We sent him packing from Washington. That kind of energized the worst kind of liberalism, and he's been absolutely destructive of America. And I'd say, that liberalism that has seeped into everything, starting, obviously it predates Nixon, but it got a big boost following his downfall in '74. I mean, I could say more, but I think it was I think it was a great loss for America. He was a highly competent president, a highly intelligent president. Just watch these interviews. Just how clearly, he was already getting on in age, but how clearly and succinctly he could encapsulate issues, what happened, what needs to happen, where America goes, and so on. No president can do that. And he spoke entirely without notes. Just watch him speak. He speaks without notes. No other president could do that. Certainly not Barack Obama, ludicrously overrated. His intellect was ludicrously overrated. So that's what I'd say about the downfall of Nixon. Anyway, Vic goes on and says, we're reaching the end of May, and this month always makes me think about the famous May 1968 in Paris. It's one of these enigmatic events in history that always fascinated me, and it always felt so difficult to grasp. What do you make of it? Also consider a film night that features May 68 topic and its aftermath. I could recommend some interesting European films and post a couple of propositions on locals. Please do. I think it's a great idea. Please do. There are a number of 68 films I could think of. There was one made by Louis Malle. I've forgotten the title, but that was made about 20 years later. But there were films, I guess, that kind of captured the mood of Paris of '68, even if they were made a few years. The Jean-Luc Godard films captures sort of the mood of Paris. But yeah, but any suggestion would be great. It's a very interesting story. What happened in '68. One aspect of it was obviously that de Gaulle, who seemed invincible, suddenly he had feet of clay. He ever since he came back in 1958, he was just he dominated French political life. Um, and he won election after election. Just landslide after landslide. His goal lists, then swept everything. And then suddenly, when '68 hit, he didn't know what to do. He was essentially, he almost like collapsed. He was at a loss, and really, France was saved not so much by de Gaulle, but by Pompidou, Georges Pompidou, who was his prime minister, who very cleverly separated the workers from the students. If you remember, it was both those students and the workers rose up in protest. So there were just strikes everywhere, um, and then you had and obviously the students. They had their own self-indulgent demands. Most of it was to do with basically they didn't want to pay any fees for studies, understandable, and basically to have sex in their dormitories. That's what students really care about. They don't really care about all these other things. Yeah, we're against Vietnam or whatever, but ultimately it was about being able to have members of the opposite sex in the dormitories, which they weren't allowed to do before. So that was their basic issue that they were protesting. The sexual segregation of the dormitories. So there was that, but de Gaulle, Pompidou, basically bought off the workers. He bought them off by giving them huge pay raises, massive pay raises, which eventually was also going to gave France economic problems down the road. But by buying them off and getting them to go back to work, then in a sense the '68 dissipated, because then the students were left alone to protest. Well, nobody really cares about the students. No, the idea that, hey, my daughter is going to be spending the night with her boyfriend in his dormitory. That didn't exactly excite French men and French women very much. But then what was also interesting is, as I say, de Gaulle was completely out of it. He had no idea what to do. He really was. He had aged. He'd been in power for 10 years. He aged badly. But then there was a massive demonstration on the part of it was an anti-communist. The whole point of it was this anti-communism. So all of these characters like Raymond Aron and what was the name? André Malraux, all these big French heavyweight intellectuals, Cold War intellectuals, and so Malraux and Aron and various other figures. They said, "Oh, it's all about the communists. The communists are a threat. The communists want to seize power." And so they held this huge rally of this anti-communist rally, even though really the communists had played no role in '68, but they made it seem as if it was the communists. And de Gaulle also played into that. De Gaulle also said, "Yeah, it's the communists. The communists are trying to seize power." But this was the turning point of in '68. This huge demonstration, anti-communist demonstration, led by Malraux and Aron, and that really dissipated. The students were left, protesting. Nobody really cared about that. The important thing was that the workers went back to work. They were bribed, um, by Pompidou, and that really kind of dissolved the impetus 68, and then de Gaulle called for new elections, and he did very well. The new elections was a big triumph for him. I think people were very unhappy. I think nobody likes disorder, and even though you'd have to say it was the government that allowed this disorder to get completely out of control. There was a fear. Hey, this is 1789, 1848. France has had its revolutions. It seems like, hey, there doesn't seem to be any order anywhere. Where there's no police, no where's law and order. So naturally, the French bourgeoisie were very unhappy about this lawlessness, and so they voted overwhelmingly for de Gaulle in '68, the post the post May '68 election. But de Gaulle, I think, realized then that his time had come and gone. I mean, he saw that his moment was now past. He hadn't handled this particularly well, and he then decided to hold a referendum on a very obscure issue. He proposed some kind of an administrative reorganization of France, and then I don't basically administrative reorganization of the regions in France. Kind of an obscure thing that the French like to do. And but he said that if I lose this referendum, I will resign, which was quite an astonishing thing to do. Said, if I lose this referendum, I will resign. And he of course, I mean, if a political leader says, if I lose this referendum, I will resign, then of course everyone's going to vote against the leader. It's like David Cameron, who said that if he loses the Brexit referendum, he will resign. And sure enough, people say, "Oh, fantastic! I think I'll vote for Brexit just in order to get David Cameron to go." Anyway, de Gaulle lost the referendum and he resigned and disappeared. Boom! Just absolutely disappeared into his little village, Colombe des Églises, whatever it was called. Yeah, and then he died very soon after that. It's almost like he was a broken man. 68 seemed to have broken him because, as I say, he resigned in 68. In 1970, he died, and insisted in his last will and testament that he's to have a private family funeral. He doesn't want a state funeral. Anyway, so what I was saying, that really the goal was past it. The one aspect of it, the conspiratorial in me, and I haven't really seen conclusive evidence of this, though people have hinted at it, that somehow the Americans were behind this. I haven't seen any real evidence, and I haven't can't see how the Americans were behind this. But it's possible, the CIA, they had connections within the unions, had connections within student organizations. I mean, the Americans obviously detested de Gaulle. They always had. They going back to World War II, they never supported de Gaulle. It was Churchill who was a supporter of de Gaulle, but the Americans really didn't want him. And then when he returned, they were very unhappy about him, particularly his anti-American policies on Vietnam and everything else, and of course his withdrawal from the NATO's integrated command, and then developing his own nuclear weapons. France the force de frappe, the nuclear weapons. So the Americans really didn't want him. They didn't like him. They never liked him. So there have been speculation that the Americans were somehow involved in '68. I haven't seen compelling evidence. If anyone has seen compelling evidence of American involvement in '68. Like I see, I mean, obviously, the Americans were happy to see him go, but whether the Americans played much of a role in '68, it's just something that's a historical curiosity. But anyway, that's my view. Pompidou, having saved de Gaulle in '68, was of course, as always happens, promptly fired by de Gaulle. Just like Marshal Zhukov in the savior of the Soviet Union in World War II was immediately fired after the end of World War II. Obviously de Gaulle did not want anyone eclipsing him, but then Pompidou did come back, and he was the first post de Gaulle president. He was elected in '69, and then succumbed to cancer. He lied about his health, and then died in 1974. Even though the newspapers had been saying, "Where is Pompidou? Where's Pompidou? Last time we saw Pompidou, he looked terrible." And the Elysee Palace kept denying, "Oh, no, nothing. He's just got the cold. Just suffering with the flu. Nothing wrong with him at all." And saying, "Hey, he looks terrible." And then suddenly they announced, "Oh, Pompidou's dead. He had cancer." So it was a sort of an early kind of Biden era deceit. So anyway. Anyway, thanks, Vic. Ivan Grozny says, "What's up, George?" Well, not much. Good to see you. And then Ivan Grozny says, "How come I never see you on Judge Knapp or Piers Morgan?" I don't know. I guess they don't invite me, so that's why I'm not there. But thanks for asking. And then Robert says, just to put forth the countervailing view regarding fentanyl, when opium was legal and smoked, ODs were virtually zero. Users nodded off long before hitting lethal blood levels. Criminalization pushed use to more potent injectable forms like fentanyl, which now cause more than 100,000 deaths annually. The war on drugs didn't save lives. It turbocharged risk, recalling Jefferson's observation that government is best which governs least because its people discipline themselves. I think Robert, you and I have had disagreements about this before. I mean, I can see that that libertarian argument. The problem that I have with these drugs is that they serve no useful purpose. They're very potent. They're very dangerous. They destroy lives. They destroy families, and somebody has to pay the cost. And so, if you legalize these things, then first of all, you'd have to then pretty much legalize everything. But okay, that's a separate issue. But if you legalize, then it's still somebody is going to pay the cost of all the damage and destruction, because nobody's just going to be allowed to die. Oh, I'm OD, or I'm an addict, I'm a junkie. Well, nobody's going to say, oh, then, that's too bad. You made a lot of wrong decisions in life, so you can die out here on the street. No, I mean, somebody's going to have to take him into hospital. Somebody's going to have to pay for rehab, and so on. All of it is very, very pricey. And given the already, staggering healthcare costs and likely to increase, then I don't see the justification for it. So it's just basically there are no benefits to this. These are always bad things that people imbibe, and somebody else has to pay the cost. So somebody else who's people who have led their lives without doing drugs, without all these engaging in dangerous activities, which I think drug use is. they're going to have to pay for it, and there's obviously um, something unfair about that. But anyway, we've disagreed about this before, Robert. I just don't I don't see the advantages of legalization. Anyway, Ergot says, Ergot agrees with Robert. I fully agree. Decriminalization is the only proven way to deal with drug trafficking. The Portuguese example is very telling. It's very smart, incentive driven approach. It destroys economic incentive for trafficking. Hence, the black market supply and the crime that goes with it goes to zero. The issue has become a medical one where dependent individuals can seek medical help, including drug prescription that is less dangerous. The results are clear. Fewer addicts, less crime. I don't think that that's quite the case. I mean, I know people cite this about Portugal, but there have been other um, accounts of Portugal, which is don't paint such a it's in such a rosy light. But as I say, you still have the issue. I mean that the idea that you can just simply have we'll put them on medical treatment and then we'll put you on rehab and then everything's fine and then nobody has any real problem. I don't think that's it's doable and and you know um, so I mean, because I think these are fundamentally very dangerous, much more dangerous than alcohol, and of course alcohol has negative consequences as well, but nothing on the same scale as drugs. So I don't see the advantage of it. But the Portugal thing, as I say, I'm I've read things about that, which again, that it's somewhat not at all like that. But I think I'll post something on the Portugal case on our locals board. But anyway, thanks for bringing that up. It's very interesting. And then Judy Hotchkiss, thank you very much, Judy, as always, for your generosity. Judy says, I would say that the biggest change we might have seen if Nixon stayed in was that he could have done what he promised to do, which was to reinstate the dollar peg to gold and reset fixed exchange rates among currencies. When Nixon had shut down that system in 1971, he said it was only a temporary measure to relieve pressures on the dollar. If he had actually been able to reinstate it as he planned, then no financialization of globalization has ended up destroying the US. Well, that's interesting. I guess it was already very difficult. I mean, almost immediately in 1973. I mean, he was obviously still. United States was suffering from inflation, which is, of course, the reason why he closed the gold window. Because the dollar was losing its value, and as a result, everyone was converting the dollar into gold, and essentially the United States was running out of gold. So, but the economy really started tanking quite seriously in '73. So the inflation, and then as his political problems mounted through 1973, that had an effect on markets, and then of course there was the oil shock of the fall of 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, which really put the economy into a recession. So you had the inflation, there was the post-Vietnam inflation that America was still suffering from, and now you had the oil shock recession. So really, the Nixon economy was doing very poorly in '73, '74, which incidentally was the real reason why his poll numbers were seriously tanking. I mean, up until then, even through Watergate, he still maintained a certain level of popularity. But after the oil shock, then his poll numbers, were really dangerously underwater. Now, again, the media interpreted, oh yes, because of Watergate, he's unpopular because of Watergate. No, he was unpopular because people didn't care that much about Watergate. It's usually the media bubble cared obsessively about Watergate. The public really didn't, but the economy was doing poorly, and as a result, Nixon's polling numbers were tanking. So I don't know. Given the dire economic straits America was in the 1970s, I think it would have been difficult to return to something like a gold standard. But I agree with you. I think Nixon in '71, Nixon did see it as an interim measure, and that's what he said when he addressed the American public, or what he said. But when he announced the closing of the gold window. But I just think the economy was really in terrible shape in 73, 74, the last 2 years of Nixon. And then Robert, apropos of 68, Robert says, for someone like Foucault, May 68 was not simply a student protest or a class struggle, but a breakdown in the legitimacy of authority. Yeah, I suppose. People no longer believed in what they were told, and the mechanisms that were supposed to ensure obedience stopped functioning. Yeah, no, that's right. It was such a strange moment when, hey, there's no one in authority. No, there's no police. What happened to authority? Now the problem with that is, well, how do business owners, small business owners, shopkeepers, always the lifeblood of France, the small shopkeepers, how do they feel about lawlessness and lack of authority? They don't like it very much. They get afraid, and they're worried that their boulangeries or cafes are going to be destroyed by an unruly mob. So there wasn't really very popular among the French middle class. I mean, Paris, it was all people were very excited, as always happens. Parisians thought, hey, this is very exciting, but the middle class really weren't very enthused about it. That, which is, I think, why de Gaulle undeservedly won this huge election victory in '68. Undeservedly, because, as I said, he did, he had just let the whole thing out of control, and he had no idea how to respond to it. So no, that's that's what Foucault says is right. But of course, France had these moments before. It's not unlike what happened in 1789. The mighty French monarchy just suddenly collapsed. 1848. So anyway, Ergo says, incidentally, I was a child in Paris, and my parents worked on Boulevard Saint-Michel. I have recollections of tear gas and of a generally festive atmosphere. Yeah, it was festive. But I remember, my parents, they kind of, because I was quite young at the time. This is France. You have no idea how things are going to go. It is the home of the French Revolution, and it is true that France did have a powerful communist party, and was to have a powerful communist party until for another 10 years. And you have to sort of wonder what is going to happen in France. As it turned out, it all kind of dissipated itself. But because it was France, then it seemed like, hey, who the hell knows where this is going to end up in. So, and then Stone River says, "Oh, Stone River, thank you so much for let us know about what that court ruling was." And then Robert says, yes, that just to underscore the fact that governments and their courts have become dangerous pests. Since 1970, global maritime shipping firms have quietly exited slow, costly, unreliable government courts in preference for private arbitration. Bodies like the LMAA, SCMA, faster, cheaper, and run by maritime experts. The shift cemented by the 1958 New York Convention proves law doesn't need a government monopoly. Maritime arbitration shows how markets can provide justice better than the state. Huh? All right, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, the problem really, as I see it, isn't so much the courts are slow. I mean, obviously the courts are slow when they want to be. Courts can be really fast when they want to be. And I think that's what we're learning, as we learned, incidentally, in the Nixon era. Courts can move. If there's something that they care so much about, they will move fast. And so I think that's, but if they're not interested in it, you can just, let things lie around for years and years. So that's kind of the problem with the courts. Now, as we've seen in the now in the Trump era, all of these courts move very fast and have taken it upon themselves to govern the country. This is not what they're supposed to do. That's not what the function of the courts. The function of the courts in a very simple way is to arbitrate or between two litigants, or to decide, adjudicate rather than arbitrate, to adjudicate between two litigants. They're not really supposed to govern the country. They're not supposed to usurp the powers of the legislature. They're not supposed to usurp the powers of the executive. And remember, back in the day, people used to complain, "Hey, legislating from the bench. You're supposed to follow the law. It's what this is. The law was passed by Congress, and you have to follow it." And then the court said, "Nah, I don't think so. We just have some vague idea of what the Constitution says, and we just say this law doesn't follow the Constitution, and that's it. We just, famously how they did the abortion issue with Roe v. Wade. I mean, there wasn't any legislation; they just simply made it up, by some dubious understanding of the Constitution. Same way when they legalized gay marriage, there wasn't any legislation; they just sort of made it up. But now what they're doing isn't so much legislating, but simply stopping the executive from executing the laws. And so it's clear, and it's been clear for a long time, that the courts are the biggest impediment to democracy. We've seen that very much in the case in Europe, and they are the biggest impediments because they are unelected. I mean, whether you like Congress, you don't like Congress, whether you like the president, you don't like the president. At least they've all been elected. They've won votes, they've run for office, and they're doing whatever they promised to do, or they didn't promise to do. But either way, there is some accountability, because in 2, 4, 6 years' time, they will have to face voters. Courts don't do that. This guy, there was one of the judges on this International Trade Court. He says, "Oh, he was a Reagan appointee." Well, how old is he? I mean, if he was a Reagan appointee, I mean, Reagan he was a president 40 years ago. So if he was a Reagan appointee, he must be kind of getting on in years, and this goes on all the time. I mean, these judges, they just go on in years. I mean, there was in one of the January 6th cases that Julie Kelly wrote about. I forgot the name of this Reagan judge, and the way she described him, he's in his 80s. He actually can't even move about anymore. He has to be helped, to move because he's so getting on in years. But he's still there. He's going to keep going until he drops dead on the bench, as happened, of course, with other justices like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what was his name, the Rehnquist, Scalia. They just die on the job. They never retire. They just die on the job. I mean, so it just shows they're not. You can't have unaccountable people who never have to face any of the consequences of their decisions, running the country. It's just inimical to the practice of democracy. But anyway, the slowness, it wouldn't be so bad, I think, if they were slow. But it's how selective they are, when they slow things down, and when they can move, in 15 minutes. If it's something they care about, then they move. Quarter of an hour later, they've already issued their injunction. Summer Petrus. There's a slight correction, George. Good to see you, Summer Petrus. We met in Budapest recently, so good to see you. Slight correction, George. David Cameron, in fact, stated if he lost his Brexit referendum, he would stay on as Prime Minister. Really? It was Kenneth Clarke who stated that if he lost, he was toast, and so it proved. Cameron resigned the following morning post referendum. Wait, you may be right. I mean, my recollection is that he did promise during the campaign that if he lost, he would step aside, and that this had acted as an incentive for people to vote for Brexit. I mean, you may be right. I can't argue now because I'd have to look it up. But that's my recollection, that Cameron did say that he would, if he lost, if the referendum went against, because he threw himself into the campaign passionately, and so that was why it seemed like he that he. I mean, in a way, I mean, I guess he stepped aside. I mean, he continued as prime minister until a successor was chosen. I mean, it's not like he resigned and they was gone. I mean, he said he was going to step down as prime minister, but he stayed on just to oversee the transition to a new prime minister. But that's interesting. I'll look it up. Because maybe I'm misremembering. Because my recollection is that he would step aside. Either way, it was a huge mistake for him to throw himself as passionately as he did into that referendum, because then people, there's always an incentive for people to vote against his against his wishes, because they wanted him gone. And so if recall, in the first referendum, the 1975 referendum, Harold Wilson, who actually was in favor of the EU, so much so that he had actually applied to join the common market in, I think, 1967. He applied to join the common market. De Gaulle said no, but he did apply to join the common market. but when he returned to power in 1974, he promised he would have a referendum. He said and he indeed passed legislation to hold the referendum on membership of it wasn't called the EU, it was called the Common Market. But he kept his distance from the campaign, even though everyone knew that he was in favor of the Common Market. He kept his distance. And so, whichever way it was going to go, nobody would say, "Oh, well, Harold Wilson, what a humiliation," because they said, "Hey, let other people debate. I'm going to keep my distance from it." So Cameron didn't do that, and obviously he paid the price. I'll look up as to what exactly he said, what his position was on whether he would resign or not if the referendum went against him. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I mean, I've gone on for too long. Down memory lane. We're talking about de Gaulle, May 68, Harold Wilson, the good days. Anyway, and of course, we talked about Nixon and the gold standard and courtesy of Judy. So anyway, thanks to everybody who joined me. Thank you for all of your really interesting comments, thoughtful observations, and challenges and so on. So I really enjoy it. Really a lot of fun. So we will be back. We'll do some podcasts over the weekend, and then Peter and I will do our joint live stream on Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern time, and then solo on Tuesday. Thank you very much, everybody, for today. See you soon. Good night. Bye-bye.